Welcome to the debate. Today, we are diving right into one of the most polarizing ideas in modern wellness, the dopamine detox. You see it everywhere, this concept of dopamine fasting, and it's being pushed as the big solution to our crisis of instant gratification.
And it resonates because that crisis is very real. We're living in an environment that I'd call, well, limbic capitalism. It's a system that's just perfectly designed to hijack our most ancient brain functions, our craving for immediate, easy rewards. People feel it. They know they're being manipulated, and they're looking for, frankly, radical ways to take back control.
And that is exactly where the real disagreement starts. The central question for us is this: is the term dopamine detox actually rigorous, accurate neuroscience? Or is it just an effective but, ultimately misleading shorthand for what is actually clinical abstinence?
I'd argue that the results, the quantifiable results, and the sheer intensity required, things like focused fasting and hormesis, they completely validate the detox approach. It gives people an accessible framework, a quick, hard reset.
My issue, though, coming at this from neuroscience, is with that word itself, detox. Abstinence is absolutely vital, I agree. But detox is it's reductionist. It completely fails to capture the complexity of neuroadaptation and the very real timeline that's needed for these reward pathways to restore themselves. We're not flushing out a toxin. We're trying to rebuild the brain's fundamental wiring.
Okay, so let's start there, with what you're calling a misunderstanding. You're saying the premise of a detox makes it sound like dopamine is a poison we need to eliminate. If that's the wrong way to think about it, what is dopamine really?
Dopamine is fundamentally, it's the universal currency for motivation. It's how the brain measures the addictive potential of anything, a substance or behavior. The real goal of any kind of recovery isn't to eliminate it. It's to restore what we call the pleasure-pain balance.
Explain that balance for a second.
Of course. In the brain, the neural circuits that process pleasure and pain they're inextricably linked. They work like two sides of a teeter-totter. When we compulsively hit these high dopamine stimuli, scrolling, shopping, substances, whatever, our brain adapts very quickly to maintain balance, to maintain homeostasis. It starts to downregulate its own pleasure mechanisms and upregulate its pain mechanisms.
You're talking about the gremlins from the source material.
Exactly. We call it allostasis, neuroadaptation. The whole system it tips heavily toward the pain side. The gremlins get bigger, faster, more numerous. And pretty soon, you need that stimulus just to feel normal, just to get back to baseline, not even to feel pleasure anymore.
Right, but the way to fix that still requires a really intense removal of the stimulus. And let's be honest about the sheer scale of the rewards we're up against today.
I understand why you emphasize that. But a term like fasting implies a quick fix, and that just doesn't hold up in a clinical setting. We know that reversing that allostatic load, getting back to a true baseline, it requires sustained recovery. Our experience shows 2 weeks of abstinence it's almost never enough to re-level that balance. We often need 4 weeks minimum. And even then it varies wildly depending on the drug's potency and how long it was used. The brain it needs time to start making its own dopamine again.
I'm not denying the timeline, but this whole popular movement exists because people desperately need a strategy that's quick and accessible. You can't really compare passive abstinence to the kind of radical intervention you need when you look at the chemical impact of modern rewards.
I'm still not convinced that the extreme language of detox is necessary.
But look at the numbers. This isn't theoretical. Amphetamines cause a dopamine release to increase by 1,000%. 1,000. Cocaine, 225%. The modern digital world, this limbic capitalism, is delivering rewards on that same scale, just through behavior instead of a substance. That confirms we need something radical, something people can name and execute on their own.
That's a critical point. You've brought us right to the core of the problem, the potency of these digital rewards.
Absolutely. We've literally created digital drugs. Social media, video games, online porn. They all use the exact same reward anticipation pathways as traditional addiction.
The mechanism is very similar, I agree. The uncertainty of getting a like on TikTok can be even more reinforcing than the like itself, you know? It keeps that balance perpetually tipped towards craving. And the design it's deliberately addictive. Flashing lights, notifications, the endless scroll, the bottomless bowl.
Which is why we need a drastic measure, a fast, to break the cycle.
But here's where I think the distinction is key and why a simple chemical fast doesn't quite cover it. The addiction, I would argue, is to the compulsive cycle itself, not just the chemical reward at the end. I mean, look at the patient Chi, who was addicted to online shopping. She'd spend hours searching for cheap, useless things, order them, and then return them the second they arrived. She wasn't addicted to the stuff. She was addicted to the hunt, the anticipation. That behavior can persist even when the dopamine hit is pretty low.
That's a good case for therapy, sure, but long-term exposure to these powerful stimuli, digital or chemical, it fundamentally alters the brain's physical structure. And this actually supports both our points. It explains your long timeline for abstinence, but it also proves the need for a radical intervention to begin with.
It does. I'm just not convinced that a weekend fast is enough, because heavy, long-term use can lead to what we call a persistent dopamine deficit state. And this is something you can actually see on brain imaging.
And what does that deficit state, what does it feel like for the person?
It's a sustained loss of sensitivity. The brain gets so used to these 1000% spikes that it just stops responding to normal, low dopamine rewards. A sunset, a good conversation, a meal. The patient feels anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure from normal life, and their emotional responses just flatten out. These are structural changes that can, yes, alter the brain forever if you don't address them with real rigor.
Okay, so if we agree that just passively waiting, just waiting for the gremlins to hop off the scale isn't enough to fix those structural changes, then the solution has to be more active. It has to move from just tolerating pain to the active pursuit of pain.
I have to say, I fundamentally reject the philosophy behind these rapid, high-intensity biohacker methods. The real, sustained, clinical benefit comes from disciplined abstinence that gives the brain the time it needs to readapt. It requires tolerating the unavoidable pain of withdrawal and anxiety. It requires stillness. It doesn't mean swapping an old high for a new, equally intense one.
But just tolerating is too passive for the world we live in. We need intentional, measurable action to force a change in our set point. This is where hormesis comes in, applying small, moderate, controlled doses of noxious stimuli.
Define what you mean by hormesis in this context.
It's basically a biological overcorrection. When you subject your body to an intense but controlled stressor, like extreme cold, it mounts this incredibly strong homeostatic defense. Take Michael from the source material. He uses these high-intensity ice baths, and the data confirms this kind of cold exposure causes a massive 250% increase in plasma dopamine.
That is a staggering number.
It is. It's a huge, measurable chemical fix, but it's generated internally. The euphoria people feel after is described as being exactly like a drug, like ecstasy or Vicodin. You're leveraging your body's own response to pain to reweight your hedonic set point, and you're doing it faster. It's intentional self-binding using your own biology.
That is a compelling case for acetylene for rapid modulation, I'll grant you, but I have to warn against this serious risk in that approach. There is a very real danger of becoming, for lack of a better term, addicted to pain.
How so?
You've just traded one high dopamine compulsion for another. People who lean too hard on the pain side of the scale, extreme athletes with overtraining syndrome, or your example, Michael, they find the need more and more of the stressor just to feel level. Michael eventually had to buy a motorized meat freezer to make the ice bath even colder. That pattern, that tolerance and escalation, it suggests you're just cycling right back to that same dopamine deficit state.
Well, the critical difference is the intentionality and the control of the stimulus. But I do take your point. Any high-intensity pursuit, if it's not grounded in mindfulness, can just become another escape.
And that brings us to the deeper issue, doesn't it? What's driving the overconsumption in the first place? We have to look past the chemical fix and confront the underlying psychology.
Which is what?
Avoidance. The avoidance mechanism. Modern culture is it's driven by this relentless pursuit of happiness and the total elimination of all discomfort.
this constant drive to avoid pain, to instantly distract ourselves. That is precisely what makes us miserable. It leads directly to binge watching, doom scrolling, you name it.
It's easier to numb out than to face things.
Exactly. It was easier for the patient David to take Adderall around the clock. He even said it. It was easier to take a pill than feel the pain. That avoidance is the real problem, not the specific delivery system. We are constantly running from ourselves, running from the pain that's just part of being human.
This is why biohacking emphasizes self-binding. The best ideas, as they say, emerge from rigorous challenge, not from comfort.
In true balance means moving away from that isolated, self-seeking behavior. We need to focus on things that generate low-level, sustainable satisfaction.
Which, funnily enough, requires turning outward, towards community, intimate connection, purpose. That creates its own powerful but balanced source of reward through dopamine and oxytocin.
The isolation is a byproduct of the habit, yes. But the cure requires confronting that void that's created when you take the high dopamine stuff away. And that, I think, leads us to the most counterintuitive realization of all. The true cure for the endless pursuit of pleasure is embracing boredom.
Boredom is absolutely terrifying to the modern mind.
It should be, because it forces a confrontation. I think about Sophie, the Stanford student who was terrified of walking to class without headphones. She found the simple act of walking so boring. The addiction wasn't the music or the podcast, it was the constant stimulation.
Right. That initial void is intensely painful. But boredom isn't just passive waiting. It is the necessary precondition for anything new to happen. It forces you to face those deeper questions of meaning and purpose that you were avoiding with the endless scroll.
It is the pause.
Exactly. Boredom creates the space for a new thought to form. Without that space, you're just endlessly reacting to stimuli, trapped. To truly stop running and achieve a balanced life, you first have to be willing to sit in that initial, painful void of being bored.
But it's achieved only through disciplined abstinence and mindfulness, and fundamentally through tolerating discomfort and acknowledging the harm of instant gratification. And it's a process you measure in weeks, not in days.
And whether you choose the measured timeline of abstinence or the controlled pursuit of pain through something like Hormesis, the reality is our environment demands intentional strategies and rigor. The goal isn't to eliminate dopamine, it's to restore our capacity to find joy in simple, low dopamine rewards. Noticing the trees, a simple conversation, things like that.
The debate over the term dopamine detox will probably continue. And it really highlights that tension between scientific precision and practical accessibility. But what's clear from all of this is that solving compulsive consumption means looking beyond the chemical reaction. It demands confronting the self, the part that's always avoiding and isolating. And that challenge has to start with the very difficult decision to just step into that uncomfortable space of authentic, low dopamine experience.